Welcome to a dark tale from the past, a true story that will send shivers down your spine. Today, we journey back to the 1960s, to the city of Boston, gripped by fear, under siege by a phantom, a predator known as the Boston Strangler. Have you ever felt truly safe walking alone at night? What if that sense of security was shattered, ripped away by a series of brutal crimes that seem to defy logic and leave even the most seasoned detectives baffled? That was the reality for the women of Boston between 1962 and 1964. 13 women, aged 19 to 85, their lives tragically cut short. Each murder more terrifying than the last, each scene a tableau of horror. The city was paralyzed. Fear was a constant companion, whispering in the shadows, lurking around every corner. But who was this monster? What drove him? And how did the investigation finally catch him and make him a suspect? We will analyze everything in this video. Before we delve deeper into this dark chapter of American history, what comes to mind when you hear the name? The Boston Strangler. Share your thoughts, your theories, your initial reactions in the comments below. Let's unravel this mystery together. Now, let us step back in time to a Boston on the edge and examine the chilling reign of the Strangler. Part 2, The Boston Strangler, a reign of terror unfolds. Deeper into the darkness, the reign of terror known as the Boston's Strangler began in the summer of 1962, casting a dark shadow over the city of Boston. It wasn't just the act of murder that terrified the populace. It was the insidious, almost theatrical manner in which the killer operated, a macabre signature that evolved, leaving both law enforcement and the public grappling for answers. The fear was palpable, a living entity that seeped into the very foundations of the city, altering the daily lives of its residents and leaving an indelible mark on the collective psyche. The first victim, 55-year-old Anna Sleezers, was discovered in her apartment on June 14, 1962. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death with the belt of her own bathrobe. The seemingly random nature of the crime, a secure apartment, a woman living alone, suggested a level of vulnerability that resonated deeply within the community. It shattered the illusion of safety that many took for granted. Police initially treated it as an isolated incident, a tragic anomaly in an otherwise peaceful city. However, the absence of forced entry in many of the subsequent cases, including Sleezers, hinted at a killer who was either known to the victims or adept at gaining their trust. This seemingly insignificant detail, the unlocked door, the lack of a struggle, would later become a focal point for investigators, a clue that whispered of a predator who could blend into the everyday, a wolf in sheep's clothing. Just 2 weeks later, the discovery of Nina Nichols, 68, and Helen Blake, 65, on June 30, shattered any illusion of an isolated event. Both were sexually assaulted and strangled with articles of their own clothing. stockings, and a bra respectively. The choice of older, single women living alone painted a disturbing picture of the killer's victimology. They were not random targets, but carefully selected prey, individuals who, due to their age and social circumstances, were particularly vulnerable. The sexually suggestive positioning of the bodies was not merely a byproduct of the assault. It was a deliberate act, a grotesque display designed to shock and horrify. This element of staging suggested a deeper psychological motive, beyond mere sexual gratification, pointing towards a need for control, dominance, and perhaps a desire to create a spectacle, to leave an unforgettable, horrifying imprint on the minds of those who discovered the bodies. The killer's use of ligatures, fashioned from the victim's own clothing, was another disturbing element. It was a deeply personal violation, a symbolic act of stripping the victims of their dignity and identity. Each victim was not just killed, but also symbolically undressed, their own belongings used against them in a final, cruel act of domination. The manner in which these ligatures were often tied in elaborate bows was particularly unsettling. It was as if the killer was leaving his signature, a macabre calling card, a detail too specific to be a coincidence. Was this a sign of obsessive, compulsive behavior, a ritualistic element to the killings, a need to impose order on the chaos he created? Or was it simply a practical measure, using readily available materials at the scene, a chillingly efficient approach to murder? The media, sensing the public's growing fear and fascination, dubbed the unknown assailant the Mad Strangler of Boston, and later, the more succinct Boston Strangler. This moniker, while sensational, inadvertently contributed to the killer's notoriety, potentially fueling his ego and solidifying his place in the annals of American crime. The name itself became a source of terror, a label that encapsulated the city's fear and amplified the sense of dread. The discovery of 75-year-old Jane Sullivan on August 19, 1962, strangled with her own stockings, further cemented the pattern. The killer was escalating, his crimes becoming more frequent. The city was under siege, not by a visible army, but by an invisible predator, a phantom lurking in the shadows. The police were under immense pressure, their every move scrutinized by a terrified public and a voracious media. Each new murder added to the weight of expectation, the pressure to stop the killings almost unbearable. The murder of 67-year-old Sophie Clark on December 5, 1962, introduced a racial element to the case. Clark, a black woman, was found strangled with her own scarf, a pillowcase placed over her head. This raised the unsettling question of whether the killer's motives were purely sexual, or if there was a racial component to his victim selection. While the modus operandi remained consistent with previous attacks, the pillowcase over the head was a new, suffocating detail that added another layer to the killer's cruelty. This detail could be interpreted as an attempt to further dehumanize the victim, to erase her identity completely, to make her faceless. It also raised questions about the killer's mindset. Was this an escalation, a sign of increasing sadism, or simply a practical measure to muffle any potential sounds? The year 1963 saw no reprieve. Patricia Bissett, 69, was found on March 9, strangled with her own stockings, another pillowcase over her head. The established pattern was undeniably single women, often older, living alone, sexually assaulted, and strangled with items from their own homes. The killer's ability to enter these homes, often without signs of forced entry, suggested a level of cunning and social engineering. He was not a brute forcing his way in. He was a manipulator. Perhaps even someone the victims knew or perceived as non-threatening. He could be the friendly neighbor, the helpful handyman, or even a police officer, anyone who'd disarm suspicion and gain entry into the victim's sanctuary, their home. The case of 23-year-old Mary Brown, found on May 6, 1963, marked a significant deviation in the pattern. She was not only strangled, but also stabbed repeatedly and beaten. This escalation in violence was alarming. Was the strangler's bloodlust growing? Was he becoming more impulsive, more enraged? Or was this, as some theorized, the work of a copycat killer, inspired by the strangler's notoriety? This sudden shift introduced doubt and further complicated an already complex investigation. It raised the terrifying possibility that the strangler's actions had spawned imitators, further blurring the lines of the investigation and adding to the climate of fear. Beverly Sammons, another young victim at 23, was found stabbed to death on June 28, 1963. The absence of strangulation, coupled with the brutal nature of the stabbing, fueled the copycat theory. However, it could also be argued that the killer was adapting, experimenting with different methods, perhaps driven by a desire to prolong the suffering of his victims, or to experience a different form of gratification. Each deviation from the established pattern added another layer of complexity to the psychological profile of the killer, making him even more difficult to understand and predict. The rapid succession of murders in the summer of 1963, Evelyn Corbin, 58, on September 8, and John Graff, 23, on September 23, both strangled with their own belongings, brought the city to its knees. The fear was palpable. Women were taking extreme measures to protect themselves, barricading their doors, carrying makeshift weapons, and avoiding going out alone, especially at night. The social fabric of the city was fraying, the sense of community replaced by suspicion and dread. Neighbors eyed each other with distrust. The once familiar streets now seemed menacing, and the simple act of living alone became an act of courage. The final chapter in this horrific saga was the murder of 19-year-old Mary Sullivan on January 4, 1964. The youngest of all the victims, her death was particularly brutal. She was sexually assaulted and strangled with multiple ligatures, 2 scarves, and a pair of stockings. Her body posed a "Merry Christmas" card propped between her feet. This final, macabre flourish was a chilling testament to the killer's depravity. It was a deliberate act of mockery, a final insult to the victims, their families, and the city itself. It seemed to suggest that the killer was not just driven by a need to kill, but also by a desire to taunt, to shock, and to leave a lasting, horrifying impression. The investigation was a sprawling, chaotic affair. Detectives were hampered by the limitations of forensic science at the time. Fingerprint technology was in its infancy. DNA analysis was decades away, and the sheer volume of information, tips, and potential suspects was overwhelming. Thousands of interviews were conducted, countless leads followed, and numerous suspects questioned. Yet, the killer remained elusive. The pressure on law enforcement was immense, not just to solve the crimes, but also to restore a sense of safety and order to a city gripped by fear. The eventual focus on Albert DeSalvo, a handyman with a history of sexual deviancy, was based largely on his detailed confessions. He described crime scene details that, ostensibly, only the killer would know. However, inconsistencies in his statements, coupled with the lack of corroborating physical evidence, cast a long shadow of doubt over his guilt. Some of his descriptions of the victims' clothing were inaccurate, and he seemed to have difficulty recalling certain details while being overly specific about others. These discrepancies raised questions about the reliability of his confessions. Was he simply a troubled individual seeking attention, or was he being fed information by someone else? Furthermore, DeSalvo's physical appearance did not match the few eyewitness accounts existed. Some witnesses described a younger, more athletic man, while DeSalvo was older and heavier. This discrepancy further fueled the theory that there might have been more than one killer operating in Boston during that time. Was DeSalvo the sole perpetrator of these horrific crimes? Or was he, as some believed, a deeply disturbed individual seeking attention, confessing to crimes he may or may not have committed, perhaps even encouraged or coerced by authorities eager to close the case? Could there have been multiple killers operating independently, their crimes conflated under the umbrella of the Boston Strangler, a convenient label that simplified a far more complex reality? These questions lingered, casting a long shadow over the investigation and the eventual conviction of DeSalvo for other crimes. The Boston Strangler case remains a haunting enigma, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can reside within seemingly ordinary individuals. It is a case study in the limitations of early forensic science, the complexities of criminal profiling, and the fallibility of human memory and confession. the enduring mystery serves as a cautionary tale, urging us to question easy answers and to acknowledge the profound and lasting impact of such crimes on individuals, communities, and the collective psyche of a city. The absence of definitive answers leaves a void, a space filled with speculation, fear, and the lingering question, what truly drove the Boston Strangler? The answer, perhaps, lies buried deep within the tangled threads of motive, opportunity, and the darkest recesses of the human mind, a puzzle that may never be fully solved. It requires us to delve into the psychological makeup of a potential serial killer, to try to understand the forces that could drive a person to commit such heinous acts. Was it a need for power, a desire for control, a deep-seated hatred of women, or some other, even more complex and disturbing motive? This case continues to be studied and debated, not just as a historical event, but as a complex psychological and sociological phenomenon. A stark reminder of the enduring power of fear and the elusive nature of truth. In the realm of criminal justice, it forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that evil can exist in the most unexpected places, that it can wear a mask of normalcy, and that it can leave scars that last for generations. The questions surrounding the Boston Strangler case remain unanswered, a haunting echo in the annals of criminal history. A testament to the enduring power of unsolved mysteries and their ability to capture our imagination and fuel our deepest fears. The city of Boston has moved on, but the shadow of the Strangler still lingers, a reminder of a time when fear ruled the streets and the safety of home offered no refuge from the darkness. It serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder to remain vigilant, to question easy answers, and to never forget the victims whose lives were tragically cut short. The legacy of the Boston Strangler is not just one of terror, but also one of resilience, a city's determination to heal and move forward despite the enduring scars of its past. It is a story that compels us to look deeper, to seek understanding, and to strive for a world where such horrors are never repeated, a world where the darkness is held at bay by the light of justice, compassion, and a relentless pursuit of truth. The mystery endures, but so does the hope that one day, the full truth behind the Boston Strangler's reign of terror will finally be brought to light. Part 3. The Hunt for a Phantom, A City Under Siege. A desperate search for answers. The Boston Police Department, along with law enforcement agencies from surrounding towns, faced a daunting tasking: to hunt down a phantom, a killer who moved like a ghost through the city, leaving a trail of terror and death in his wake. The investigation into the Boston Strangler murders was one of the most extensive and complex in American history, a labyrinthine puzzle that stretched the resources and capabilities of the police to their limits. They were not just searching for a killer. they were battling a pervasive atmosphere of fear that had enveloped the city. A fear that was amplified by the media's relentless coverage of the crimes. From the outset, the investigation was hampered by several factors. The most significant was the sheer number of victims and the seemingly random nature of their selection. There was no clear connection between the women, other than their gender, their solitary living situations, and the horrific manner of their deaths. This lack of a discernible pattern made it incredibly difficult to develop a profile of the killer or to predict where he might strike next. The detectives were working in the dark, grasping at straws, their efforts often frustrated by the killer's seemingly effortless ability to evade detection. Another major obstacle was the state of forensic science. In the early 1960s, DNA analysis, which today is a cornerstone of criminal investigations, was decades away. Fingerprint technology was still relatively rudimentary, and the ability to analyze trace evidence, such as fibers or hair, was limited. The police were heavily reliant on eyewitness accounts, which were often unreliable, and on the painstaking collection and analysis of physical evidence from the crime scenes, a process that both time-consuming and often yielded little of value. Despite these challenges, the police pursued every lead with relentless determination. They interviewed thousands of people, from the victims, neighbors, and acquaintances to known sex offenders, and anyone who seemed to fit the vague descriptions provided by the few witnesses who had potentially glimpsed the killer. They meticulously documented every piece of evidence, no matter how insignificant it seemed, hoping that it might eventually lead them to the perpetrator. The pressure on the police was immense, not just from the public and the media, but also from within their own ranks. Every detective understood that each passing day without an arrest meant the killer was free to strike again. As the body count rose, the investigation intensified. The Boston Police Department established a special unit dedicated solely to the Strangler case, known as the Strangler Bureau. This unit, composed of some of the city's most experienced and skilled detectives, worked around the clock, poring over evidence, interviewing witnesses, and pursuing leads. They were under enormous pressure to solve the case, not only to bring the killer to justice, but also to restore a sense of safety and security to the terrified city. The Strangler Bureau employed a variety of investigative techniques, some of which were considered unconventional at the time. They consulted with psychiatrists and psychologists, hoping to develop a psychological profile of the killer that might help them narrow down their search. They even, in a move that was later criticized, brought in a psychic, Peter Hurkos, who claimed to be able to use his powers to identify the killer. While Hurkos' involvement generated a great deal of publicity, It ultimately yielded nothing of value to the investigation and served more as a distraction than a legitimate investigative tool. The investigation was further complicated by the sheer volume of tips and leads that poured in from the public. Fearful citizens, eager to help or perhaps simply caught up in the frenzied atmosphere, reported anything that seemed even remotely suspicious. Every phone call, every letter, every anonymous tip had to be investigated, a process that consumed a vast amount of time and resources. The vast majority of these leads turned out to be false alarms, red herrings that led nowhere. But the police could not afford to ignore any of them, knowing that the one crucial piece of information that could break the case be hidden among the thousands of useless tips. One of the most significant challenges faced by the investigators was the lack of a clear motive. While the sexual nature of the assaults suggested a sexual predator, the seemingly random selection of victims, their varying ages and backgrounds, made it difficult to understand the killer's underlying motivations. Was he driven purely by lust, by a need for power and control, or was there some other, deeper, more complex psychological factor at play? The absence of a clear motive made it even harder to predict the killer's actions or to anticipate his next move. As the investigation dragged on, the police came under increasing criticism. Some accused them of incompetence, of being unable to catch a killer who seemed to be operating with impunity. Others claimed that the police were more interested in protecting the city's image than in solving the crimes. The pressure on the investigators was immense, and the frustration of not being able to catch the killer took a heavy toll on the detectives involved. Despite the setbacks and the criticism, the Strangler Bureau continued its relentless pursuit of the killer. They meticulously reviewed every piece of evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, and explored new leads. They developed a system for tracking and analyzing the vast amount of information they were gathering, using a complex system of index cards and cross-references, a precursor to the computerized databases that would be used in later investigations. The turning point in the investigation, or at least what appeared to be the turning point, came with the arrest of Albert DeSalvo in November 1964. DeSalvo, a handyman with a long history of arrests for burglary and sexual assault, including a series of rapes committed while he was dressed in green work clothes, for which he was dubbed the Green Man, was initially arrested for a separate series of rapes. While in custody, he confessed to being the Boston Strangler, providing detailed descriptions of the murders that seemed to match the facts of the case. DeSalvo's confessions were a bombshell, a seemingly miraculous break in a case that had baffled investigators for over 2 years. He described the murders in vivid detail, providing information about the crime scenes that, in theory, only the killer would know. He even led police to the locations where some of the murders had taken place, further solidifying the belief that he was the Strangler. However, despite the apparent accuracy of his confessions, doubts soon began to emerge. There were inconsistencies in his statements, details that did not quite match the evidence. He seemed to have difficulty recalling certain aspects of the crimes while being overly specific about others. For example, he described the clothing of some victims incorrectly, and he seemed unsure about the exact locations of some of the murders. Furthermore, DeSalvo did not physically resemble the descriptions provided by the few witnesses who had potentially seen the Strangler. He was older and heavier than the man described by witnesses, and his overall demeanor seemed inconsistent with the image of a cunning and elusive predator who had terrorized the city for so long. Despite these inconsistencies, DeSalvo's confessions were widely accepted by the public and the media, largely because they offered a sense of closure to a city that had been living in fear for so long. The idea that the Boston Strangler had finally been caught, that the reign of terror was over, was a powerful and comforting narrative, one that many people were eager to embrace, even in the face of lingering doubts. However, many within the law enforcement community remained skeptical. They questioned the validity of DeSalvo's confessions, suggesting that he might be a deeply disturbed individual seeking attention, or that he might have been coerced into confessing. Some even theorized that he might have been fed information about the crimes by someone else, perhaps another inmate or even a member of law enforcement, eager to close the case. The lack of physical evidence linking DeSalvo to any of the murders further fueled these doubts. Despite extensive searches of his home and other locations associated with him, no physical evidence, such as fibers, hair, or fingerprints, was ever found that could definitively tie him to any of the crime scenes. This absence of physical evidence was particularly troubling, given the nature of the crimes, which involved close contact between the killer and his victims. Despite the controversy surrounding his confessions, DeSalvo was never officially charged with the Boston Strangler murders. Instead, he was tried and convicted for the Green Man, rapes, and sentenced to life in prison. This decision was based on a number of factors, including the lack of physical evidence, the inconsistencies in his confessions, and the potential for a lengthy and expensive trial that might not result in a conviction. In 1973, DeSalvo was stabbed to death in prison by another inmate, taking whatever secrets he may have held about the Boston Strangler case to his grave. His death brought an abrupt end to any possibility of further investigation or clarification regarding his involvement in the murders. The Boston Strangler case remains officially unsolved. While Albert DeSalvo is widely believed to have been the killer. The lack of physical evidence and the inconsistencies in his confessions leave room for doubt. The possibility that there may have been more than one killer, or that DeSalvo was not involved at all, cannot be entirely ruled out. The investigation into the Boston Strangler murders was a landmark case in the history of American law enforcement. It highlighted the challenges of investigating complex crimes, particularly in an era before the advent of modern forensic techniques. It also exposed the limitations of eyewitness testimony and the dangers of relying too heavily on confessions, especially when those confessions are not supported by physical evidence. The case also had a profound impact on the city of Boston and on the way that serial killers are perceived in American society. It demonstrated the power of fear to grip a city, to disrupt daily life, and to erode the sense of safety and security that people take for granted. It also showed how the media can shape public perception, for better or worse, and how a single individual can become a symbol of terror and evil. The Boston Strangler case remains a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk within human beings and the enduring challenges of bringing those who commit such heinous acts to justice. It is a story that continues to fascinate and to haunt, a testament to the enduring power of unsolved mysteries and their ability to capture our imagination and fuel our deepest fears. Part 4. The Mind of a Killer. Unraveling the motives, exploring the darkness. The Boston Strangler case is more than just a chronicle of horrific crimes. It's a chilling journey into the depths of human depravity, a disturbing exploration of the forces that can drive a person to commit unspeakable acts. Understanding the why behind these murders is as crucial as identifying the who. What motivated the killer or killers to prey on these particular women? What psychological forces were at play, shaping their actions, driving their insatiable need to inflict pain and terror? These questions have haunted investigators, psychologists, and criminologists for decades, transforming the case into a complex psychological puzzle, a dark labyrinth of motives and desires. One of the most perplexing aspects of the case is the apparent lack of a consistent, easily identifiable motive. Unlike many serial killers who are driven by a specific sexual fetish or a clear pattern of victim selection, the Boston Strangler's crimes seemed to defy simple categorization. The victims varied in age, from 19 to 85, and while all were sexually assaulted, the level of violence and the methods used differed from case to case. This variability has led to much speculation and debate about the killer's underlying motivations. The most obvious motive, given the sexual nature of the assaults, is sexual gratification. It is plausible that the killer was a sexual sadist, deriving pleasure from inflicting pain and suffering on his victims. The act of strangulation, a particularly intimate and controlling form of violence, could be seen as a manifestation of this sadism. It allowed the killer to exert complete power over his victims, to prolong their suffering, and to witness their terror firsthand. The use of ligatures fashioned from the victim's own clothing adds another layer to this theory. It suggests a deeply personal violation, a symbolic act of stripping the victims of their dignity and identity, further enhancing the killer's sense of power and control. However, the sexual motive alone does not fully explain the complexities of the case. The seemingly random selection of victims, the varying levels of violence, and the bizarre, almost theatrical elements, such as the elaborate bows and the positioning of the bodies, suggest that there were other, more complex, psychological factors at work. One theory is that the killer was driven by a deep-seated rage against women, possibly stemming from a troubled relationship with a mother figure, a wife, or another significant female figure in his life. This rage, fueled by feelings of inadequacy, rejection, or resentment, may have manifested itself in a desire to punish and degrade women, particularly those who were older and more vulnerable. The act of killing, in this scenario, would be a symbolic act of revenge, a way of asserting power over women who, in the killer's twisted psyche, represented the source of his pain and frustration. Another possibility is that the killer suffered from a severe personality disorder, such as antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy. These disorders are characterized by a lack of empathy, a disregard for social norms, and a tendency towards impulsive and violent behavior. Individuals with these disorders often have difficulty forming meaningful relationships and may experience a deep-seated sense of alienation and anger. The act of killing, for such individuals, could be a way of expressing their rage, of exerting control over others, and of experiencing a fleeting sense of power and significance in a world that they perceive as hostile and indifferent. The inconsistencies in the murders, particularly the variations in the level of violence, could be explained by the killer's evolving psychological state. It is possible that his rage and bloodlust intensified over time, leading to increasingly brutal attacks. The shift from strangulation to stabbing in. Some of the later murders could be interpreted as a sign of this escalation, a manifestation of the killer's growing need for violence and his increasing detachment from the reality of his actions. The case of Mary Brown, who was not only strangled but also stabbed and beaten, is particularly significant in this context. This deviation from the established pattern raises the possibility that the killer's underlying pathology was becoming more pronounced, his control over his impulses weakening. It could also be interpreted as a sign of frustration, a reaction to the increasing pressure of the investigation, or a manifestation of a growing sense of invincibility. the copycat theory, which gained traction after the murders of Mary Brown and Beverly Sammons, introduces another layer of complexity to the psychological analysis. If there were indeed multiple killers operating independently, each with their own unique motivations and psychological profiles, then the task of understanding the why behind the Boston Strangler murders becomes even more challenging. It would require us to consider the possibility that the notoriety of the original Strangler might have inspired others to commit similar crimes, either out of a desire for attention, a need to emulate a figure they perceived as powerful, or a pre-existing propensity for violence that was triggered by the media coverage of the case. The confessions of Albert DeSalvo, while compelling, also add another layer of ambiguity to the psychological puzzle. If we accept that DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler, or at least one of the killers, then we must grapple with the question of what drove him to commit these horrific acts. His history of sexual deviancy, including his arrests for the Green Man rapes, suggests a deep-seated sexual pathology. His confessions, if genuine, provide a chilling glimpse into the mind of a killer, revealing a disturbing mix of sexual desire, rage, and a need for control. However, the inconsistencies in DeSalvo's statements and the lack of corroborating physical evidence raise serious questions about the reliability of his confessions. It is possible that he was a deeply disturbed individual seeking attention, confessing to crimes he did not commit, or perhaps embellishing his involvement in some of the murders. He may have been motivated by a desire for notoriety, a need to be seen as someone powerful and dangerous, or even a desire to escape the harsh realities of his life by immersing himself in a fantasy world where he was the central figure in a terrifying drama. Another theory suggests that DeSalvo may have been coerced or manipulated into confessing. The pressure to solve the case was immense, and some investigators may have been willing to overlook inconsistencies or even feed DeSalvo information in order to secure a confession and bring an end to the public outcry. This theory, while speculative, raises important questions about the ethics of interrogation and the potential for false confessions, particularly in high-profile cases where the pressure to find a culprit is overwhelming. The psychological profile of a serial killer is often complex and multifaceted, shaped by a combination of genetic predispositions, environmental factors, and personal experiences. In the case of the Boston Strangler, the lack of definitive answers about the killer's identity makes it even more difficult to construct a comprehensive psychological profile. However, by examining the available evidence, the patterns in the crimes, and various theories that have been proposed, we can begin to piece together a tentative picture of the individual or individuals responsible for these horrific acts. It is likely that the killer was a deeply troubled individual, harboring a profound sense of anger, resentment, and perhaps even self-loathing. He may have experienced a traumatic childhood marked by abuse, neglect, or a dysfunctional family environment. These early experiences could have laid the foundation for a distorted worldview, characterized by a deep distrust of others, a need for control, and a propensity for violence. The killer's choice of victims, primarily older, single women living alone, suggests a targeting of individuals who were perceived as vulnerable and easily overpowered. This could be interpreted as a manifestation of the killer's own feelings of powerlessness and insecurity, a need to dominate those who were even weaker than himself. The sexual nature of the assaults further reinforces this interpretation, suggesting a deep-seated sexual pathology, possibly rooted in early childhood trauma or a distorted understanding of intimacy and relationships. The act of strangulation, the killer's preferred method of murder, is particularly significant from a psychological perspective. It is a highly personal and intimate form of violence, requiring close physical contact between the killer and the victim. It allows the killer to exert complete control over the victim's life, to experience their terror and their struggle for survival firsthand. This suggests a sadistic element to the killer's personality, a deriving of pleasure from the suffering of others. The elaborate bows tied with the ligatures, the positioning of the bodies, and the Merry Christmas card left at the scene of Mary Sullivan's murder all point to a theatrical, almost ritualistic element to the killings. These actions suggest that the killer was not simply driven by a need to kill, but also by a desire to create a spectacle, to leave a lasting impression, to shock and horrify. This theatricality could be interpreted as a manifestation of the killer's narcissism, a need to be seen as powerful and significant, to have his actions recognized and remembered. The Boston Strangler case remains a chilling reminder of the capacity for evil that exists within the human psyche. It is a stark illustration of how seemingly ordinary individuals can harbor dark secrets and commit unspeakable acts. The enduring mystery surrounding the case serves as a cautionary tale, urging us to look beyond the surface, to question easy answers, and to acknowledge the complex interplay of factors that can contribute to the development of a killer. The case also highlights the importance of understanding the psychological underpinnings of criminal behavior. By studying the motives, the methods, and the patterns of serial killers, we can gain valuable insights into the workings of the criminal mind. Insights that can help us to develop more effective strategies for preventing such crimes and for identifying and apprehending those who commit them. The study of the Boston Strangler and other similar cases contributes to the field of criminal psychology, providing valuable data for developing profiles of serial offenders and for understanding the complex interplay of factors that contribute to their development. Ultimately, the Boston Strangler case is a human tragedy, a story of lives cut short, of families shattered, and of a city gripped by fear. While the identity of the killer or killers may never be definitively known, the legacy of their crimes lives on, a haunting reminder of the darkness that can lurk within the human heart. The questions that remain unanswered serve as a powerful testament to the enduring power of unsolved mysteries and their ability to capture our imagination, to fuel our deepest fears, and to challenge our understanding of the human condition. The search for answers continues, driven by a desire to bring closure to the victims' families, to understand the forces that drive individuals to commit such horrific acts, and to prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. The pursuit of justice, even decades later, is a testament to the enduring human spirit, the unwavering belief in the importance of truth, and the hope that even in the face of unimaginable evil, light can ultimately prevail. The Boston Strangler may have faded into the shadows of history, but the echoes of his crimes still resonate, a chilling reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring power of the human capacity for both good and evil. Part 5. Lingering Shadows and Lessons Learned. A City Scarred. A Search for Meaning. The Boston Strangler Case, a chilling chapter in American history, ultimately fades into a haunting tapestry of lingering questions and unresolved mysteries. While Albert DeSalvo's confessions offered a semblance of closure, the doubts surrounding his guilt, the lack of definitive physical evidence, and the potential for multiple killers leave an unsettling void. The city of Boston, once gripped by fear, has moved forward, yet the scars of that era remain, etched into its collective memory. A stark reminder of the darkness that can reside within seemingly ordinary lives. But from this darkness, lessons emerge. The case stands as a powerful testament to the limitations of early forensic science and the vital need for continued advancements in criminal investigation techniques. It underscores the complexities of the human psyche, the intricate web of factors that can contribute to the making of a killer, and the enduring challenges of understanding and preventing such acts of violence. The Strangler's reign serves as a cautionary tale, reminding us to remain vigilant, to question easy answers, and to cherish the safety and security we often take for granted. More than just a true crime story, the Boston Strangler case compels us to confront the profound impact of violence on individuals, families, and communities. It urges us to examine the societal factors that can contribute to such tragedies, and to foster empathy, understanding, and support for those affected by crime. It is in remembering the victims, honoring their lives and striving to build a safer, more just world that we can truly find meaning in the face of such darkness. If this deep dive into the chilling world of the Boston Strangler has captivated you, if you find yourself drawn to unraveling the complexities of the human condition, then please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue exploring these dark chapters of history, to shed light on the mysteries that linger, and to foster a community of thoughtful, engaged individuals who, like you, are driven to understand the why behind the headlines. Join us as we continue our journey into the heart of true crime, seeking answers, understanding, and perhaps a glimmer of hope in the face of the enduring shadows. Your engagement is what makes this exploration possible. Thank you for being a part of this community.